Good evening. First of all, can I congratulate the Royal Geographical Society on organising tonight's event as part of the series that you are undertaking to give us a chance to think about the future of a very small and a very fragile planet that we share with a growing number of our fellow human beings. Now, you know, we've been on the Earth for quite some time, and human beings have shown an astonishing capacity to take the raw materials that the Earth has given us, you know, started in a ball of gas, and create the world that we have today. And if those first human beings were to arrive through the doors of the RGS this evening and look around and listen, they would be utterly astonished at what human beings have achieved during the intervening however many million years it is. And yet, we are now coming face to face with the consequences of that extraordinary ability to interact with the Earth, to make things, to create things, to build things, to change things. And the fundamental truth that we are coming face to face with is there are really three types of capital in the world: human, financial, and environmental. Now, the stock of human capital is rising because there are more of us and we're better educated. Financial capital, as we've learnt in particular over the last couple of years, has a tendency to go up and go down and all over the shop. So we need it, but it can be a problem on occasions. When it comes to environmental capital, there is absolutely no doubt at all that we are depleting the stock that we have used to develop the kind of world that we live in today, in a way in which we have failed to pay really any attention at all to the consequence of what we have been doing. And that has brought us to this point in human existence. And if you say to me, you know, what's the greatest challenge the world faces, very simply, it is to live sustainably on the one planet that we've got. Because we haven't got, as my predecessors in the environment job, David Miliband used to say, you know, we haven't got another two cupboards tucked away in a cupboard somewhere that we can draw upon once we've exhausted the riches and the gifts that the one world has given us. And I would, you know, if you went back at a time in history, I'd be really interested to go back to Easter Island, because I'd like to have been there when the Easter Islanders had that final conversation about what they were doing on the island. Now, you've all seen the fantastic statues with a wonderful relief, very long noses. Perhaps that's where I originated from. And in order to get the stone and shift it around so it could get to the place where the statues all stand facing outwards to the sea, they had to use mechanical means, and that involved a lot of logs. And in order to get the logs, they had to cut down the trees. And so it went. And at some point, undoubtedly, they got to the last clump of trees, and you just wish you could have been there to hear the conversation. Did any still voice say, when the foreman said, right, lads, come on, we've got these trees to get down today because we've got to move these stones and get them up? Did anyone say, well, hang on a minute. If we end up cutting down all of the trees on Easter Island, then aren't we going to have a bit of a problem? We're going to end up with beautiful statues, but we're going to find it rather difficult to live. But they did cut down the trees, and they did find it rather difficult to live, and they had to leave. Now, it acts as a kind of cautionary tale if you get the balance wrong between what you do with your environment, using the gifts that it bequeaths to us, and the consequence for human existence. And if you just take, you know, four examples. Joe, you made the point about sustainability being more than just the environment. I think it's very important. Take just one statistic. There are just over 1 billion of us on this planet who are overweight or obese. And there are about 1 billion of us on this planet, men, women, and children, not living here, but in other countries of the world, who will be going to bed hungry tonight because they do not have enough to eat. Now, that is a fundamental imbalance. It's a fundamental injustice. And we cannot, as sentient, thinking human beings, say, well, that's fine with us, because it isn't fine with us. So that is one example of the unsustainability of human existence. The second would be the whole concept of rubbish, because one of the manifestations of our ability to do things without thought of the consequence, I would demonstrate using this hand movement. This I don't need anymore. We chuck it away, it's rubbish, I don't have to think about it. And yet we know, if you examine the rubbish tips of the world, particularly of the advanced world, you find all sorts of things in the rubbish tips that actually have a value because human beings are beginning to wake up to what we're chucking away. Take the worst example of all, Coke and Pepsi cans. The fact is, when I last checked, and when I ceased to be the Secretary of State, prices were recovering, but you'd get about £600 a tonne for an aluminium can. Someone would pay you. And we know that making a new Coke or Pepsi can uses a lot more energy than making another one out of a recycled Coke and Pepsi can. And yet we're chucking things in the hole of the ground. And at some point, and I was told that in one or two parts of the country, of the world, people have started to going back down through landfill. Landfill mining, it is called, because people have realised, I put something valuable somewhere, but I wasn't thinking about it at the time, but I need to find it again. This is not really sustainable because two things will happen. One, we'll end up short of places to dump the stuff. And secondly, the earth will finally, if we carry on like this, shrug its shoulders and say, okay, folks, you've had it all. You've used all of the natural resources. Now what are you going to do? The problem that the Easter Islanders themselves faced. Third example is the growing population and our ability to feed it, which links to the first about the fundamental inequality. The truth is, it has been science and innovation and changes in agricultural practice that has enabled food production as a whole, although it's unevenly distributed, to keep ahead of the predictions of Malthus. But you know, I think it was last year, the man who is credited as being the father of the Green Revolution of the last 40 or 50 years, an American by the name of Norman Borlaug, died. And what Norman Borlaug did was to develop the dwarf variety of wheat. How could you get more wheat on a stalk? And the problem was, the first one that was developed had a lot of wheat, long stalk, and the wheat was heavy, boom. So that didn't really work. And he developed a dwarf variety, shorter stalk, could take more of the weight. And he said towards the end of his life that if we hadn't seen this change, then the world would have needed today an area of land the size of Latin America, additional land, to grow the amount of grain that we were growing thanks to the agricultural and scientific revolution. And as Mark Twain famously observed once, he said, my advice is go and buy land, because they've stopped making it. And if you want to see the proof of that, think about the nations of the world that have now started not just buying up raw materials in other countries, but buying land, because they are wanting to secure the raw material of food production for the years ahead. And the fourth, I think, example is biodiversity, because we understand instinctively why the natural world matters. We think of nature's astonishing capacity to lift our souls and to nurture our spirits, whether it's a glimpse of the hills or the ice on a cold morning, as we saw today. But we have kind of forgotten that biodiversity of the natural world also gives us clean air, and it gives us clean water, and it gives us fuel, and it gives us food, and it gives us medicines to heal the sick. I learnt that most forcefully on a visit to the World Agroforestry Centre in Nairobi a couple of years ago. And we went into a laboratory, and there on a bench were a lot of plants. And I went down, as I tend to do, and said, what's that, what's that? I said, what's that? It was a rather spindly-looking plant. And someone said, that is Artemisia. And I went, ah! Because I knew a little bit about, I'm not a scientist, by the way, I knew a little bit about Artemisia because some clever person discovered it had qualities that when you mix them with other drugs produced a much more powerful treatment for malaria, and suddenly the world couldn't get enough of Artemisia. And we went down the bench, and then there was this bit of bark. And I said, what's that? And they said, that is the bark of the Prunus africa tree. And they told me that some other clever scientists had discovered it contained properties that were helping in the fight against prostate disease and prostate cancer. One bench, two plants amongst many, and one is helping to treat diseases of the predominantly poor world, one is helping to treat diseases of the predominantly rich world. And if you had been strolling through a forest somewhere and you had happened to come across the only Artemisia sapling in the world and the only Prunus africa sapling in the world, and you had been looking at the canopy and gone, and crushed them both, think what humankind would have lost because we didn't know the value of it until we discovered it. Now, that is the truth about our world, and we have to have that understanding and that knowledge if we are then going to act. Now, the second and last point I wanted to make was about what we now need to do, having absorbed that understanding of the point that we find ourselves at. Now, as a politician, frankly, scaring people and frightening them doesn't really work. Think back, those who in the audience who can remember back to the first advertisements warning about the dangers of HIV and AIDS. Do you remember the television adverts? They sort of great blocks of granite came out of the land, and it said, "Don't die of ignorance." Well, it made people think about AIDS, but it didn't actually give them any useful information about what they should do to protect themselves from the HIV virus. And the truth is, one of the difficulties that the environmental movement sometimes faces, and it's a point others have made, is this. There's a tendency to sort of wag fingers at the world and say, you've all been very, very bad, and you've been very, very naughty. And I was on a platform a few years ago with an old friend of mine who was saying, look, when Martin Luther King was trying to address the great challenge of his age, and he stood before that enormous crowd in Washington on the march, he didn't begin his speech with the words, "I have a nightmare," did he? He said something else. He said, "I have a dream." And it seems to me that we have to have a vision, dream, whatever word you want to use, of what this future might look like. And the truth is that all of the qualities that created the problem in the first place, because of human beings' extraordinary capacity to interact with the earth and use it and shape it, science, innovation, skill, craft, imagination, innovation, sheer determination, are exactly the qualities that we need if we're going to get out of the hole that we have dug for ourselves. So we have actually the means in our own hands and in our minds and in the skills of people. And I would just highlight 5 things. One is because
Hilary,
we are
so
just...
say
yeah,
three minutes.
3 minutes. Cancun, I think it's very unlikely we're going to get a deal. Because the politics of this are really difficult, and the politics in a global recession make it more difficult. But we need a climate deal, because without agreement on how we're going to divvy up the finite quantity of carbon we now understand the world can cope with, we're going to be in trouble. Secondly, governments have to act. And the importance of the Climate Change Act in Britain was it set a framework for a new way of trying to understand the impact of carbon emissions, and it's begun the process of us counting carbon in a way that we have never done before. We understand money, we understand living within your means when it comes to cash. This is the century in which we have to understand living within your means when it comes to carbon. And there's lots that government can do, saying we won't put that waste into landfill anymore, that we will encourage renewable energy through things like feed-in tariffs, which have led to quite a big change. The third thing is business has to lead. And I was very pleased to accept the invitation tonight, not least because I'm sharing a platform with Stuart. And I want to pay tribute to the leadership that Stuart has given, because there are lots of people who haven't shown the leadership, but Stuart certainly has. And on the subject of plastic bags, I remember the meeting in my office where my only ally amongst the supermarkets for doing something was Stuart, so I'm particularly grateful to you. Fourthly, we have to think about the way in which we design and build things. And the last thing is, it's about us too, because believe you me, if people think, right, you're an elected representative, you go sort it out, I'll get on with the rest of my life, give us a call when you've finished, it doesn't quite work like that. And it has to be a partnership between us, because we need your encouragement as your elected representatives to do what is required, and we need your understanding when we get on with it. And the thing that gives me encouragement is this. When you see the change happening, wherever it is, in communities, in businesses, I always used to say to myself, blimey, if it can happen here, it can happen everywhere. Thank you very much.
Hilary, before we move on, a couple of questions. There are some people who would say that in Labour's many years in power, actually you failed to articulate a future, and while you did some things, like you encouraged the development of social enterprise, maybe clean tech, actually you never really followed that through in terms of creating a level playing field and actually creating real change in society. And actually that the amount of distance we need to cover, that you actually, you did some things, and that's absolutely true, but actually you never took a radical stance, and actually, a lot of people actually felt that government was not leading, but actually was being pushed to take action.
I don't think that's a fair assessment, honestly, and I'd say of the Climate Change Act, the world's first, I'd call that pretty darn radical. I remember the meeting of the Cabinet Committee where we decided we were going to have a Climate Change Act. And you look at how the impact that it has had around the world, I'd call that pretty darn profound leadership, including in the climate negotiations. I think that's the first thing. Secondly, it isn't just down to government. Here I am sitting next to someone who has shown enormous leadership. And one of the things that helped to make leadership, to change the attitude of business, was the work that Nick Stern did, of course, in his groundbreaking report. Gordon Brown and Tony Blair asked him to produce it, which he said, I've done the economics of climate change. It's a lot more expensive to do nothing than it is to do something. And I saw from my vantage point that it had a huge impact. And the third point I'd make is this. The environmental movement said exactly what you said to me this evening. At the time of the fuel price protests, when the price of fuel went up, there were a lot of people on the streets, you might have thought as an environmental minister, as a government, trying to argue, well, actually, I know it's difficult, but these are things that we need to do. I tell you, at that moment, when we turned around to see, okay, who else is making the argument, we couldn't find a single environmental organisation saying a word about that. And I don't mean to tell it as a negative story, but I'm just making a point. It's easy to be saying you're not going far enough, and sometimes I think the definition of a politician is someone who has not yet done enough, and that may well be the case. But the reason I tell the story is, frankly, we have a shared responsibility here, and it's tough for us sometimes, and we show leadership, and you tell us where we do a good enough job or not, but other people have got to go show leadership too, especially when times are difficult.
Okay, and I just want to pick up on, because obviously there's national governments, but obviously we need global change and global coordination. We've seen Cancun, again, is unlikely to do that. What do you think is going to make the difference? That is, actually, you've got America retreating back into sort of its climate denial and actually likely to do very little. So what is actually going to help? If the problems are so big, we know what the problems are, we can't hide away from them, but actually you see governments retreating from the challenge. What's going to make the difference that's going to actually bring them out?
Well, in the case of America, it's partly to do with domestic American politics. President Obama has had to put a lot of effort into his healthcare legislation and has seen that as a bigger priority domestically in the States than climate legislation. And the standoff is between the developing countries that are at the leading edge of industrialization, who say to the rest of the world, well, you've had all the benefit of the carbon, you've got to do it. Fine, we've got to lead, and I accept that entirely. But if we woke up tomorrow morning to discover that America, Europe, the OECD countries, Britain, Australia, Canada, had ceased emitting carbon, supposing we found that magic switch, the truth is we would still be facing the threat of dangerous climate change because of the concentration in the atmosphere and the rising emissions from China, India, and other developing countries as they develop. And that tells us that each of us has to make a contribution according to our stage of development. And that is a really difficult political task because it's the oldest question of all. How do we share out something between us? That's the first point. Second point is about the climate science. As we were talking about in there, it has been under considerable attack. And if people don't really want to face up to it, they say, well, the science isn't entirely clear, and well, maybe we can leave it a bit longer. And the third thing is it is quite difficult to do something now that is tough for a benefit that isn't really going to be seen until generations to come. And there are great short-term pressures in society, and in fairness, politicians are part of that, but so are all of us.